I'll be discussing with us all today the role of teachers in schools in helping children after traumatic events. We have two sections to this. One is how teachers can help in the classroom, which I'll be presenting, and then we'll have Claire talk about what teachers can do after a traumatic event to look after themselves. So, how teachers can help in the classroom. What I'd like you to do now is to have a think about what's the most useful strategy that you've found to re-engage kids in the classroom coming back in after a traumatic event. One of the most important things you can do is continue being a good teacher. So for most of you, if not all of you, this will mean that you'll be reassured by what I've got to say. It's important to continue supporting your children's education, and now that you've been inducted into trauma reactions of children of different ages, you'll understand what you're looking for if you're concerned. And also it's important for you to be aware of how to refer on or who to refer on for further assistance within the school environment and then beyond. So the first and most important thing you can do is monitor symptoms over time. You as a teacher are in a unique and valuable position in that you get to observe children over long periods of time. And this means that you can pick up on particular changes that you might notice in their behaviour or emotional regulation. So it's very important that you take time to be curious and look for changes in behaviour and family circumstances. Perhaps talk with somebody that can support within the school, like a guidance officer or a school nurse, or even another teacher, the principal. The next most important thing you can do is maintain routines. This is so vital to children in their development anyway. It provides a sense of security through predictability of their world. But after a traumatic event, it is absolutely vital. Children look for those routines, those structured environments, knowing what happens next because it makes them feel safe in their world again. Things like knowing that we always do maths on a Wednesday morning and what we need to be prepared for that. That's also important that if you change the routine, even just slightly, that you pre-warn students of this so that they can prepare for that and understand what's going on. It just keeps things consistent, reduces stress. And it also would assist you in knowing what's going on in your world as well. All good teachers provide a great routine and structure to their day. What most teachers are definitely concerned about after a traumatic event is what to talk about, how to talk about, when do we talk about it, do we talk about the traumatic event. And it is actually something that can be helpful. I guess most of the fear is around what the reaction will be of students and whether they'll become distressed by talking about it. What's important to know is not that talking about it will cause distress, but how you talk about it is going to be important. I'd like to show you the vodcast by Professor Brett McDermott on this because he presents this very well.
One of the things that you might talk about in your staff room is what do we say as adults? Well, you have a very clear role here, and the role is all about modelling of distress and modelling of normal emotions. In some respects for children, and especially the younger they get, your behaviour is actually the most important thing. If you can allow a conversation in your classroom or a drawing activity and to be seen to be calm and in control and not anxious about this, then that behaviour is very, very powerful. And the kids will see that this adult, responsible authority figure is dealing with this in a very calm, in a very measured way. And that's a powerful thing for the kids to see because they will see that calmness and a measured response is the way to go. So the first thing is how you behave. Now, if you're yourself very traumatised, and this is possible, certainly I have staff in my service who are very traumatised, then you need to be thoughtful about how you deal with that, and you mightn't be the right person in your classroom setting to bring up the floods. You just need to think about how you're going to do that. In terms of words, well, I think the words are all about countering children's ability to catastrophize and countering children's ability for their imaginations to run with this and run with this a long way. So, for instance, after a Sydney bushfire disaster, we know that 30 deer died. Well, suddenly in some children it became 300 and then 3,000 deer died. This is a classic example of children running away with information. Okay? So you need to, with your words, model that this flood is over. Because it stopped raining, the danger has stopped. Now, you might want to be thoughtful about, depending on the age of the children, about, yes, it could rain again. And yes, we still are La Nina for older children, and there is the chance of more rain and more flooding. But clearly your words need to be about a measured response that the threat is over at the moment, and now we're all about rebuilding and recovery, and we're all about getting our lives back together. So I would have those kind of words, and I would be looking to fear generators in the classroom, children who are very vocal about it still being an active threat. We want to move people away from this position of active threat. And I think teachers and teaching aid and other staff have a great role in doing that.
So you'll see that Brett came up with some really interesting ideas about how to approach talking to children about this, and how important that it is that they do want to talk about it. You'll find that kids will talk about this if you avoid the situation of this discussion anyway. And they'll talk about it in the playground where you won't have any rules or boundaries around what they're discussing, which means things can be catastrophised and blown out of all proportion, and that's when children might feel distressed. So within the classroom you can place rules around this talk, and you might change this over time and make it age appropriate. So for children that are quite young, you might find that drawing is what's most appropriate, and just spending some time doing that, and then perhaps sharing that in a group discussion with the young kids, and even using it as a lesson in social emotional learning by naming some of the emotions they might be feeling, like fear and sadness. Make sure though, when you're having these discussions, that you contain the fear. Just reassure children that the threat actually is over, and that we're focusing now on recovery, rebuilding, and getting on with our lives. Arrange extra support if you need it. It might be for some of the students you have in your class. Remember, some children may have lost a loved one, or they might be feeling grief over loss of pets and favourite things, as Robin discussed. So if you feel that's necessary, get an extra body on board. Another teacher, deputy principal, teacher aide, or a guidance officer is helpful. Might be important to work out whether you're okay with this as well. Teachers aren't immune to the effects of disasters and traumatic events, so if you feel like you might not be able to manage or cope, then ask somebody else to take on that job for you. Make sure you keep that teacher role. Obviously, if you've shared in the experience, you'll want to talk about that as well, but the focus here is on the students. Model calmness. By being calm and positive about what's happened, you'll show that this is a good way of dealing with this event and what happens after. Always focus on your strengths and positive coping strategies and any positive outcomes. Pull out of what they say, what was worked well, what went well, what they're doing well now. And always feed that back, not just in the discussion about the event, but all day, all throughout the day. Older children might want to discuss those more complex issues, such as relationships. It's important to maintain in the classroom your clear boundaries and expectations of behaviour. School is still about learning, and that's our core business in schools. So it's important to make sure that that remains the focus. Completing schoolwork and the behaviour expectations of the classroom. Follow up with logical consequences if there's a difficulty with behaviour. You might adjust what you do within the classroom as the presentation of curriculum. You might immediately post a disaster or traumatic event. Make your lessons a little bit shorter. Create mini breaks in between where there's a little movement. 5-star jumps after that maths lesson. This just breaks up the day and keeps that concentration on board, because as we've heard from Alex just previously, concentration is one of the things that becomes difficult for students. So just make a few adjustments, but keep your basic curriculum the same. If you find that you've got some students that are having some difficulties with their emotional regulation and then their behaviour, and you're constantly following up with logical consequences, it might be worth having a conversation with that student. It might be worth exploring what else is going on, because we know that trauma can present in some students as acting out behaviours, not just withdrawal. Some further support you can do within the classroom that's often helpful for students is setting up a buddy or support system. Many schools do this anyway. I know in primary schools they'll buddy up their prep students with the Year 7 students, and I believe they do the same in secondary schools. So if you've got that naturally going on, ensure that you keep that going, and particularly after an event that causes distress. And maintain it over the long term. It's often that we go in and put all these strategies in place and do some really good work, but then forget it by about, term 3 after something's happened. You've got lots of other priorities. Just make sure that you do remember that these things are important over time. You might set up safe or relaxing places. Just a spot in the room where you've got a few cushions for someone to go and just take some time out if they're feeling distressed. For older students, you might set up a procedure. So for adolescents, it might be just saying that they need to go to the toilet or require a quick drink, just to take some time out of the stress of what might be going on within the classroom. It's important to provide choices where you can within the classroom. It seems after times of distress and traumatic events that your whole world is all over the place and you don't have any sense of power over anything that you do anymore. So it's quite important that where you can and gently provide a few choices over what activities are being completed within the classroom. It just regains that sense of control over their world again. You can anticipate difficult times and plan ahead. I know when we were at Withcott presenting to teachers, they'd said they had an experience at the end of the school day where a big heavy storm came, and of course there was anxiety from the students as well as the teachers, in that no one knew what was happening. Will it flood again? Is this really bad? So we talked about that and we said, well, what's a good idea is why don't you sit down with the students, why don't you make a plan for when things like this happen, particularly at the end of the day, because apparently that's when they're most often going to happen. Make a plan for making sure the students are close to you so they can hear what you're saying and reassure them that they're safe, and have things in place so that they know that everyone's going to be okay. It's important to, I guess, also think about that in terms of what might trigger reactions in students. You might be surprised what does trigger a reaction, but if you notice one, it might be important to follow up with that student or the class if it's all of them, to work out what they can do in future if that's going to cause them some distress. It might be things like loud noises, but it might be something that you're not aware of. Just check in with your student over that. It's always important to focus on strengths and positives. We do this anyway as teachers. It's something that we know encourages positive behaviours. And it's also really good after events where people's worlds are shaken to make sure that they do realise that they do have strengths and there has been positives that come out of things. It's also important to help students build support systems. And it might be just establishing what support systems they already have. Their friends, their peers, their cousins, their aunts, their uncles, their other teachers they have in the school that they were friendly with. All kinds of different people in their world that they can go to if need be. Important in the school environment so that in times like in the playground they're not always seeking you out as the teacher as a support. They can go find their older buddy, for example. They might go find their older sister that's in the school, or they might go find a previous teacher that they're familiar with out on the playground duty, just to have a chat with them. So it sort of shares it out a bit more, and they realise there's a lot of support around them. So I guess some key messages from this section, just before I finish, is that it's really important. You have a vital job in the recovery of students in these times after a disaster, in that you've got a unique opportunity to observe them over time, to talk about what's going on for them following an event, and also to show that you care by maintaining a structure around their lives and boundaries for their behaviour and expectations of schoolwork. And it gives you an opportunity to be curious about what's going on and know when and how to refer on if needed.